Okay, so let's talk about the use of language in animal rights activism. I'm going to take this as a point-by-point response to the statement put out by the Real Cool Dudes Dominion documentary. So the statement they posted opens with, "Language matters." And not to be too pedantic, I will go along for this ride, but just as a general statement, I agree sort of that language matters, but are we saying that the accuracy of language matters? Because sometimes yes it does, or sometimes as an artistic tool, language matters in order to be provocative and provoke feelings. I think it matters then too. Sometimes language can be used to create a more compelling and vivid emotional relationship with a body of work, and I also agree with this. I think in this case I'm being persuaded that tact in language matters above art and accuracy, which, I mean, there might be occasions when that's the case. I don't think I generally agree with that though. Anyhow, let's review the case that's presented to us. The statement from Dominion goes on, "We thought it necessary to write a post touching on the issue of particular language used by animal advocates and how it can be harmful to marginalised folk and in return to the animal liberation movement. Recently, it has been widely discussed topic as to whether or not it is appropriate to use words such as rape, slavery and Holocaust to describe the plight of non-human animals. Given our film is often used to justify the use of these words, we feel the need to weigh in on this. First of all, congratulations and thank you for creating this film." This is me now, not them. Thank you for creating the film. This might get confusing back and forth. Maybe I should put on a voice to do that bits. I don't know. I won't. That might come off a bit mocking and... no, but let's not get into that territory. As a dependable and harrowing resource that activists can direct people towards when they intend to show evidence of specific violations that animals endure, I think that film's great, and I really appreciate that it exists. It's a solid, good bit of work. Kudos to them. Given that a viewer will observe in the documentary what are, by definition, instances of animal rape and animal holocaust, and that these are potentially triggering to those who have suffered the human equivalent of such violations, if we are to value tact when discussing animal abuse, as we're being compelled to in this dialogue, when we discuss these things with human victims and we recommend a documentary such as Dominion, arguably, ought we not make them aware of the disturbing ordeal that we're recommending that they watch, knowing that this could be quite triggering to them? I mean, to this point, would the right thing to do be just to call it what it is and warn a victim of sexual assault that I'm directing you towards a documentary that depicts sexual assault, which might trigger you, but it is sexual assault of an animal? That might just be within the realms of our responsibility. Anyhow, their statement goes on. "We understand that by dictionary definition these terms may be technically accurate, but this is a superficial and harmful justification that does nothing but generate controversy and division without any benefit to the animals themselves." I think that's probably too absolutist as a statement. But going on, it's also not superficial to use accurate terms. I would counter that denying a victim a label that accurately captures the weight of their endured suffering on the grounds that others have suffered violations which also warrant this category, perhaps due to the belief that human sufferers suffer more to a greater extent than an animal, I think that's a superficial reason to disqualify someone from a category. Humans may suffer more than animals if they're enduring an equivalent trauma, and I agree that vegans shouldn't be using these terms just to needle human sufferers, but denying animal victims of a belonging to a general category that does accurately describe their suffering just undermines the animal sufferers. It doesn't equivocate them to human suffering. It doesn't mean that animals and humans are the same and the suffering that they endure is exactly the same suffering. It's just that those particular violations share territory and they both belong to the same category of violation. Similarly, I wouldn't deny the belonging of rape category for a coma patient, for example, who has been violated while they were not conscious, simply on the grounds that a human who was mentally present during their violation will have likely faced greater physical and mental trauma. They suffer differently, just as animals also suffer differently from how humans suffer, but it still happened, and it still meets the criteria. It still belongs in that category, and allowing them both belonging of that category undermines nobody. It certainly isn't intended to undermine anybody. Anyhow, on they go. Racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism are still prominent issues in today's society, and folks are still suffering under the current system in which we exist. People from marginalised groups have voiced time and time again that words like rape, Holocaust, and slavery are hurtful and harmful to them. And it cannot be denied that regardless of the dictionary definition, the word Holocaust will always be associated with the mass slaughter of Jewish people in World War II. I agree that that is the first thing that people think of, and probably a very common misunderstanding that people have is they think that the word Holocaust was invented to describe World War II. It isn't the case. Regardless, you're insisting that we listen to the voices of human sufferers, but there is disparity and a lack of consensus among human sufferers. Some feel that it is absolutely appropriate to use this language. While I'm undoubtedly sympathetic, skin-achingly sympathetically, I can't deny I'm pathetic with sensitivity. If I personally think about the Jewish Holocaust for too long, I become a soupy mess. I'll sit and stare and just sort of fade out, looking into nothingness and feeling lost and bewildered at the scale of what humans are capable of doing to each other. I can't think about it for too long without really, really hurting and feeling for people. I am a strong empath. Perhaps that's partly why I'm vegan. Undoubtedly it's one of the ingredients, and it weakens me to think of that kind of suffering. I get it. It's not for lack of appreciation and understanding the significance that I say this, but survivors and their descendants of, or indeed sexual assault victims, who deny the use of accurate terms to animals who do suffer qualifying violations, might be so intensely ambivalent about struggling to balance their own suffering and victimhood while simultaneously being accused of that which they are, serving as an oppressor in another scenario. Especially as so much of the violation happens out of sight, and they engage as a consumer, and it feels no more than a transaction of money for goods. Further to the anti-Semitism claim, I would dispute that on the grounds that it is the case that during the Holocaust, that we refer to as the Holocaust, Jews were executed and tortured. However, I do not believe that we would take it for anti-Semitism to apply that to another, or to apply the use of that term to another separate human Holocaust. So if, for example, a group of if women started being Holocausted, would we deny the application of the term, or would we not say, oh no, a Holocaust is happening again, but this time to women? It wouldn't be anti-Semitic to claim that the Holocaust that was happening to women was a Holocaust. We don't reserve this term only for that Holocaust, other than that it's the only one that we really think of or are aware of as a collective. The intention here is to reserve the term for humans, and not to reserve the term for Jews. Jews were not totally alone in the Holocaust either, or in the Holocaust either. Or do we feel that travellers and homosexuals that were Holocausted in the exact same Holocaust don't qualify for the accurate application of that term for their ordeal? Again, no part of this is intended to hurt anybody. We're just talking about things that do hurt. Anyhow, it's a long statement. Let's push on. Next paragraph. It is absolutely our duty to listen to people from these marginalised groups, whose perspectives, those of us from more privileged positions, can never and will never truly understand or experience, and to be the best allies that we can possibly be, always learning and evolving by hearing them and acting accordingly. Some individuals within those groups may choose to make such direct comparisons themselves, and this post is not directed towards them, but their experiences are not for the rest of us to co-opt. Discussions about these parallels may be important for us to have as a species, but only when done so with respect and sensitivity rather than callously being used for attention on social media. I find that there's more in this paragraph that I find myself agreeing with, generally more in terms of ensuring that we're being sensitive when using quite weighted issues. I don't think it's something that should be thrown around like it doesn't matter. Regardless, I don't deny that I'm unable to fully appreciate an individual experience, but even where there is a shared experience between individual humans, one victim doesn't necessarily relate directly to the experience of another. I've known sexual assault victims who shudder to be alone in the room with a man because they're so, or they're left so shocked and consumed by the memories of an event that happened to them. But I've also known rape victims who depend on dark humour to cope with and move on with their life. I wouldn't choose to deny either of them the dignity and the security of moderating how I approach their own experience or how I relate to them about a subject. And again, I'd not bring up these topics in order to needle them. This isn't about hurting anyone or undermining the human experience of suffering. It's not simply about being provocative, at least not in all cases. I mean, what's being suggested here is to never use these terms for animals, but using these terms isn't the same as hurting people. It's not in order to do so, it's in order to use accurate terms. We use them because they're true. All victims are entitled to truth, and we can tactfully manoeuvre through one-on-one conversations in response to a person's needs to survive and cope. Again, that's not animal specific. If in a conversation with a human who is a victim of a sexual assault, for example, and we're discussing an entirely separate case of human sexual assault, if that conversation topic is too intense for a survivor, I would definitely opt to modulate my language or refrain from engaging in the topic in order to protect that person's sanity and that person's safety and security, while not denying the experience of the other victim. I don't need to say, oh, fine, let's not talk about it, that person wasn't raped. It still happened, but just let's not hurt you in order to express it. Again, this is to suit the needs of the individual, and not the rule for referring to the actual events. We can't just never talk about rape. We can't just never shine a light on human rights violations or animal rights violations. We can't never talk about the ways that females might be oppressed en masse in other nations, for example, and just never have that conversation because some members of our own culture might be also victims of similar abuses. We have to talk about these violations en masse in general and call them what they are, but flex our approach to support people in one-to-one discussions. That seems reasonable. I mean, besides, without the shortcuts that accurate language allow us, describing the event of that violation without saying the word can be all the more graphic, all the more vivid, and all the more triggering. I mean, further to this point, it is our duty to listen, not just to people, but to the marginalised groups. You know where I'm going with this. Vegans and activists will often refer to themselves as speaking for the voiceless. Well, how do we listen? How do we listen to and do justice for a group so marginalised that they don't even have a voice, unless we use as for them, and when we elect ourselves as the voices that speak up for them, we can't then surrender a part of their narrative just to make those who already do have a voice feel more comfortable. Again, I'm referring to the mass conversation, not one-on-one conversations. That's not justice. Anyhow, on to the interesting bit. We then walk into studies territory. So, aside from the harm this language can cause, studies, e.g. Micah 2006, Bongiorno, Bain and Haslam 2013, Freeman 2009, have shown that often such language is counterproductive and turns people away from the overall message of animal liberation. So ethics aside, this is simply not effective activism for animals, especially when we already painted as being overly hysterical, manipulatively emotional in our advocacy. Animals do not care whether we use one word or another, but the people we're seeking to engage with on their behalf frequently do. And unless we're seeking to build a movement solely comprised of people who never themselves experience systematic suffering, this is something that we have a responsibility to be aware of. So let's take a look at one of these studies. I'm not going to go through all of them. I have assumed that you put your best foot forward and taken a look at Micah 2006. By the way, I do agree that the best way of doing right by animal victims is to engage in effective activism and convince the most people, so I'm ready and willing to be compelled here. In looking into Micah 2006, within the extract describing the methodology, we find that we are dealing with 52 discussants at a university. That is the sample size that we're dealing with. Onto the methodology, we find that what has been shared here are extracts of animal rights based posters of varying degrees of intensity and impact, and some of them contain imagery that is really unsettling even to me to look at. Some of the cases where there is within the detail of the study there are images of all the shared leaflets and images, and some of them do contain allusions to the Jewish Holocaust. So there is one that shows an image of Jews within the Holocaust adjacent to chickens within factory farming. It's a very provocative image. There are others that simply contain the words "meat is murder," or some appeal to more of a Christian agenda. There's a variety in the imagery. The point is, and the observation from the study is that where you have these more intense and provocative and sensitive topics being used as part of the campaign material, there is an immediate response of offence, outrage, in general just more of a negative response, and the conclusion based on that is this would insinuate that people are less responsive. Well, no, they respond to it, but they don't respond to it by going vegan. I must say that that's not really a good measure of how effective activism is. I mean, if I were to engage a room of 52 people with the gentlest activism out there, I don't think we'd leave a room with anyone going vegan if they weren't interested. I mean, part of activism is, or part of the problem that you have as an activist a lot of the time is it's very easy for people to just ignore. So the least effective campaign is probably the one that says, please, please, please go vegan. I don't want to tell you why it's bad, but just trust me. So 52 non-vegans did not go vegan in response to shocking imagery. 52 non-vegans probably wouldn't go vegan because you say, I've never felt fitter as a vegan. 52 non-vegans probably wouldn't go vegan just because you tell them what they're doing isn't nice, or because, what about the golden rule, or because, come on, it's 2020. All the cool kids are doing it. It's hard to make people change, especially if they can go on feeling comfortable about what they're doing. What we might find is that this initial strong negative reaction actually embeds in someone, even though initially they want to reject it and they hate what they're seeing, they hate the argument. It stays with them, and perhaps when they're further away from the point of being offended, they've retained the idea, and perhaps further down the line they're able to reflect on it and take the comparison for what it is, in its truth, not just in its provocation, draw the parallel, recognise their own hypocrisy, and maybe even change. I'm not advocating for exploitation of real life victims. Not at all, but I'm advocating for the use of accurate language, and for, at least in the realm of debate, for parallels to be drawn. I mean, it may be the case that for a broad campaign, some intense imagery, I wouldn't say actual Holocaust imagery, that's not what I'm talking about here, but some intense imagery or language might be necessary in that it's harder to ignore and would have a greater impact. But that one-on-one, people will respond better to rapport and encouragement, but they do still need to be held accountable in order to change. You can't coach somebody through their own values or appeal to their individual sensibilities on a billboard. Flexibility and tact is necessary one-on-one, no doubt, and yes, a degree of tact is necessary. We shouldn't seek to exploit human victims, but that's not what using accurate terms is. I mean, this study is about using the most shocking ads that have been used by campaigners, and saying on that basis we can't use terms that accurately describe things that animals are really enduring. On with the statement. We just don't need these words to discuss the plight of non-human animals. Words like rape and Holocaust are used for shock value, but they do little to actually educate people on what's being done to animals, which can and should speak for itself. And to that I would say maybe we do need to use those words and maybe we don't. It really depends on the case, it depends on the individual sensibilities, but where it's accurate, those are the words. That's what's happening. And we don't get to disqualify animals from belonging to a category of violation that they belong to. It's definitely not always the best route to activism, but it certainly can be. The statement goes on. Learn the standard practices that are legally acceptable and talk to people about them. Tell people the figures of animals being killed each year for human consumption. Show them footage or films such as Dominion that explore the suffering and oppression within the animal industrial complex without needing to exploit the suffering of other oppressed groups. The facts are shocking enough, and they act to educate. The thing is, these standard practices are graphic and disturbing, and if we are worried about triggering human sufferers of violations, I think the word rape is actually less intense than the accurate visual or the accurate descriptive summary of the dairy practice. I think that's much harder to sit and listen to. The step-by-step description of what happens to animals than to just hear the word rape. The use of these terms is not distinct from the facts, which they emphasise in that statement, facts all in capitals, but I mean, these are facts. You're telling us use different facts, or use facts without using this specific list of terms which are factual. Use specific facts. Use facts that don't also apply to humans. I mean, the use of Holocaust imagery is, I must say, I don't think that's very sensitive. The events do have parallels. Animals are experiencing Holocaust, but I agree that using imagery of the Jewish Holocaust isn't something that's within my territory to use as an activist. I mean, if a Holocaust survivor wanted to, cool. I agree with you at that point. It's for them to deploy if they want to. They certainly have the right. I don't think it's for me to use that. But in discussion and debate, that's a different ballpark. We need to help people relate their real-world experiences to something that's kept so out of sight and out of mind for them in order to reframe what that person views as oppression. It's a kind of a necessary step in debate a lot of the time. Yeah. On the statement goes. The fact that Dominion is widely relied on as a tool for outreach and education, and is frequently credited in decisions to go vegan or to get involved in activism, yet is consciously devoid of such terminology, and would not be made any more effective by its inclusion, surely highlights that there is simply no need for it. To this I would say, great, you're right about Dominion being such a great tool, and the impact that it has, and a lot of people will credit it for making them go vegan, but it's full on, and it's a bit long, and you aren't going to convince everyone to watch Dominion. You can make people listen to you when you, like, perhaps someone won't watch the full length of Dominion, or any of it in fact. Maybe they're like, I don't want to see that. When campaigners show footage to people, so often they'll shut their eyes and walk away, I don't want to see that. In fact, I've seen cases of the police being called on activists who show that kind of image in public because people are so offended by it being shown. You can't just make everyone watch Dominion. It's a great tool, but we also need to employ conversation, which is actually softer than the imagery, and to the point that it excludes those specific terms. showing those things happening. I mean, you don't need to say, if you're showing a visual of an animal being raped, it does nothing to simultaneously go, hey, look, this animal's being raped. You're seeing it, that's the full impact, you don't need the words. But where you don't have the imagery, all you have are your words. I think that paragraph eats itself. Anyhow, back to the statement. We're getting closer to the end now, so do hang in there. While we often see attempts by conservative voices within animal advocacy to frame as speciesism or somehow detracting from the movement of animal liberation any position that encourages compassion towards oppressed humans or acknowledgement of their suffering, this is nothing but a deflection aimed at maintaining an unjust and oppressive status quo. Typically, these are the same voices who respond to outcry over the murder of black people with "what about white people?" Anti-speciesism and anti-oppression are complementary, non-conflicting ideas. So I think this is a mischaracterization of that argument and intended to deploy I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not trying to accuse anyone of anything, but I think that's intended to be politically divisive. I can tell you now, I'm not conservative, and I don't respond to outcry of the murder of black people with "what about white people?" Not at all. I also don't think that acknowledging human suffering is speciesist. I don't think it is something that detracts from animal liberation. I'll gladly acknowledge human suffering, but I won't use that to disqualify animals from accurate discussion of their suffering. That's... I feel like that's a willful... And I'm sorry to say this because I respect the people who made this documentary, but I think that's willfully misunderstanding the point of view that they're arguing against in order to win the debate. I don't know, that's got to be one of the weakest things I've said. Anyhow, so, on the go. We've also seen a number of comments and messages expressing surprise or anger that we, as the creators of a film about the atrocities committed upon animals, have this broader anti-oppression stance. But the message of Dominion has always been that all forms of systematic oppression are linked, and that none are morally justified. The film ends with a call for us to do better as a species, not simply to end animal agriculture and pretend it's only wrong in our world. And that is a call that I gladly answer. Vegans, for the most part, will agree with this broader anti-oppression note. I do as well. Injustices in general make me sick to my stomach. Human rights violations keep me up at night. It's not that I have a single-minded, I only care about animals perspective, but I do care about animals, and you won't tell me to disqualify them from acknowledging the suffering that they go through, because I care about them, and I care about the human victims too, but it neither disqualifies the other. Anyhow, final paragraph. Well done for sticking in. If you have, boy, I can't imagine. Anyhow, we can advocate for animals and accurately convey the level and scale of their suffering without exploiting the suffering of oppressed humans. We do not need to tokenize and harm other social justice issues to further animal rights. It is at best simply unnecessary and at worst a harmful hindrance to our cause. To this I would say, the use of accurate language to describe animal suffering does not mean that we lack consideration for human victims. I've covered this earlier. Exploiting human suffering is not the objective, and not something that I would encourage. And where it is, where it is the objective, stop it. We don't need to, that's fine. But using a person's real life anti-oppression values that so many people uphold is a necessary tool in debate. As a jump-off for a hypothetical, as a challenge to a person's hypocrisy. It's not exploitative. It's not to take away the weight of, or it shouldn't be approached with flippancy or casual mention. It should be with the weight of, this is a Holocaust, and that's terrible. It's not exploitative taking away accurate language or reference to ideas that are easy for humans to conceptualize and exist within our collective frame of reference is stripping the voices away from those who volunteer their voices on behalf of those who are already voiceless. What voice is left? How weak may we whisper? Should we sit silent as the grave?